Good afternoon. I believe we're live. Welcome to the panel. From our homes to yours, this is How to Mine History for News Stories. Beneath this lockdown beard, I'm still Alan Smale, and I'll be moderating this panel. I think you probably all know by now that these sessions are being recorded, and so be aware of that. We'll be batting things back and forth between ourselves on the panel for the first 20 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Q&A. I've noticed we've had some really fabulous questions coming in on other panels, and I'll be anxious to get to those. But we often get a lot of them, so if we don't get to your question, please don't hold it against us. Okay, and we'll be closing at the 50-minute mark so that people can take breaks before the next panel and so forth. But I imagine that many of our panelists will be on Discord afterwards to continue the conversation. So now I'll ask my panel to introduce themselves, state your pronouns if you wish. Let's start with Day, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Day Al-Mohamed. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an author, a filmmaker, and policy wonk. My most recent book is a novella, The Labyrinth's Archivist. Hopefully it is showing up on the screen. And I know yesterday, as part of eSpec Books, they had the big launch, and they're actually re-releasing Baba Ali and the Clockwork Djinn. And I learned to hold my books up on screen from Alan, so thank you, because I would never have thought of that. For this panel, I actually wanted to bring up the anthology Those in Peril, which is a bunch of alternate histories related to naval warfare. And I actually have a short story in here, which I may talk about a little bit in relation to this. So, other than that, I'm thrilled to be here, and we're going to punt to the next panelist.
Okay, cool. Go ahead, please, Jean.
Oh, hi, I'm Jean Cooper. I'm an editor for Changeling Press, and in my day job, I'm a reference librarian, so I have some acquaintance with a lot of different resources.
Okay. Next up, Roberta. Introduce yourself to us.
I'm Roberta Rogow. Depending on how you look at it, I'm either a filker who writes or a writer who filks. My specialty is writing historical mysteries in which I kind of twist the history. And one of the series that I have written is set in an alternate history Manhattan. There are 6 books in the series, and the most recent is called Madness in Manatas. Manatas being Manhattan Island as if the Spanish Moors got there first.
Okay, that's great. And last but not least, because I was going alphabetically, Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Scott, pronouns she, her. I write science fiction and fantasy and have been doing so for long enough that trying to list all the genres that I write in would take more time than I have. My most recent novel is Finders, which is far future space opera. And I'm here, I think, because I'm a historian by training, and world building and the use of history is about my favorite thing about writing science fiction and fantasy.
Okay, great. I'm Alan Smale. I go by he, him. Regular Balticon people may know me as a member of the singing group, the Chromatics, who often perform there. I'm on this panel because I'm also an author, the writer of the Clash of Eagles series, most prominently from Del Rey. Let's try something I haven't tried before and see if I can hold them all up at once.
Yes.
So there we go. That's my series from Del Rey. The idea is that the Roman Empire has survived in its classical form until the 13th century, and it's now moving into North America at the height of the Mississippian culture. And so a lot of the story focuses in and around Cahokia, which is a great Native American city of about 20,000, based around huge earthworks, big earthwork mounds and plazas. And so both for the Roman side and for the Native American side, I had to mine quite a lot of history in quite a lot of different ways. Okay. So on to the questions. I think we'll want to be talking about how we research. We're obviously going to be talking about the research aspects of this, but let's also emphasize on the new part and talk about periods and things that may be new to at least some readers or writers. So let's talk about some time periods, events, and cultures that are underrepresented and underutilized and so on. I'll go in the same order for this, for the first question. Day, talk about underutilized cultures for us.
Sure. My last name is Al-Mohamed, so more than likely you're going to hear about the Middle East. In part, I was born there, I was raised there, and one of the things that I haven't seen usually in any kind of alternate history is actually things talking about the Middle East. And if you think about historically the trade that came to and from and through that region, it's like there's so many things there that have this amazing potential. I mean, one of the simplest and most fun things that I found, and this is where we talk about finding stuff. You find something, go, this is cool, and then from there ideas blossom. And one was, I found an old map of Jerusalem, and it showed the demarcation lines of the different parts of the city. And even today, it's the city of the three great religions, and it's like, and you could see like this is the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Jewish quarter, and one of the things end up in the novel is at the time faith and mysticism and magic, at least let's talk about history, were considered, and they were all muddled together a little bit. So I'm like, well, if I'm going to write my alternate history, let's take that and rise with that idea. And so the three great schools of magic rose in Jerusalem. And so I want to, and so you're going to hear a lot of bias me going, I want to see a whole lot more stuff set there, just because of so many things that pass to and from and through that part of the world. And there's some amazing things that come from culture and history. And I will admit, one of the toughest things has been very little has been translated to English, but in the last 5 or 10 years, there have been so many things that have been translated that I think that it is now, there's this rich playground that's available to folks that wasn't there before, that I'd say, okay, now go play.
Okay, that's great. Yes, I was going to actually ask about the difficulties of research of some of these things later on, so that's very apropos. Okay, Jean.
I think that Northern Europe and the eastern part of Europe is very underutilized. They have a great deal of history that's available in primary sources, and we just don't see that in any writing nowadays.
Okay. All right, Roberta, talk to us about underutilized places and times.
Well, there are a couple of eras that we were talking earlier. I don't write about them because I can't, because I don't have the information. I absolutely bow to the medievalists who know Latin and Greek and all that. I have set at least one of my novels in the early federal period, when nobody knew that this American experiment was even going to work. One of the books that I have now at the Agent, which may never get published in today's rather iffy publishing situation, deals with the very beginnings of America, of the United States under the Constitution, when New York City was the capital. And it was all completely being rewritten. And the last time that there had been a republic at all, aside from Venice, which was really an oligarchy, was Rome. And everybody knew how that one ended. So nobody knew what was going to happen. And it was all brand new, and it was wonderful. And there are a lot of little pockets of history that haven't been explored simply because there isn't enough material to mine, and it's ripe for guessing. I pointed out in our discussion that Harry Turtledove has written 4 novels under the name H.N. Turtletaub about the interval between the fall of Alexander and the rise of Rome, which is another one of those, I won't say dead zones, because a lot was happening, but it hasn't really been explored. And it was wonderful because it was a fermenting time.
Yeah, it's amazing how little documentation there is about some regions of history. One of the reasons why we know so much about, see so many stories about Caligula in the 1st century AD is the records were really bad outside those times. Okay.
Well, he was really somebody that you had to think about.
Well, that too. He's a kind of interesting character, but even so, yes, you don't see many things set later on because we know less about it. Melissa.
Well, and I think that's, I mean, everybody's mentioned a bunch of things that I would have also mentioned. But one thing I'd like to riff off of is what Roberta was saying about looking for places that are documented not in written sources, but in archaeology or, less traditional sources. I've been particularly interested in very late Roman Britain because there's been a bunch of archaeology done there that looks really interesting, and suggests that the transition between Roman and post-Roman and Saxon is really very blurry, and that blurring of cultures is interesting to me. And it's things like that and corners of history that are harder to explore. Of course, in the moment I think of something, I can think of 6 people who've written about it, so that's always a difficulty.
One of the big problems with, for instance, Roman Britain, is that all of the data that we have, all of the information is from the Roman side, because they got rid of everything else.
Well,
And so you have to interpret what these other societies were like from Rome.
but there's a great deal more happening on the archaeological side. There's a great deal more turning up that is indicative of what the local population was doing and how the local population interacted with the Roman conquerors, how Roman goods and ways may have been absorbed or may not have been absorbed over time, and that's what I mean by the archaeological sources. That's providing some of that other perspective that you don't get from the written sources.
Yeah, for a very long time, we didn't know very much about the Carthaginians, for example, because the Romans just completely destroyed that culture. But we're able, through archaeology and through improved archaeological methods, there's actually quite a thriving industry in the academic world right now. Not a lot of it is known outside that, but there's a huge interest in Carthaginian studies, which I wouldn't necessarily have seen coming a few years ago.
I read, when I was about 11, I read a wonderful fantasy novel set in Carthage and had never been able to recover it or find it. But I would love, there is a period I'd like to see more of.
Yeah. Well, I'm working on something there, so we may get to see that eventually.
And speaking of Roman Britain, there's a series, I wish I could remember the author, set in Roman Britain. It starts with a book called Medicus, and maybe somebody on the chat can remember it, who wrote it. But there are 6 or 7 of them by now, and it is a disgraced Roman aristocrat who has become a medicus, a medical man, attached to the Roman legions, and has picked up and married a British woman. And you get both sides, so to speak. And
I'm interested.
of course, it's a mystery story, so he solves murders.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the author, but I do know the series. But I'm interested in really, as I said, post-Roman. I think somebody said Ruth Downing as the author.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. Thank you so much. I have an absolute sieve of a memory. I remember titles, I remember plots. I can't remember authors.
And of course, somebody's also mentioned Rosemary Sutcliffe, which, yes.
Yeah, I'd also like to see things from other parts of the world. Like, I'm actually hoping that through Worldcon, I'll get to know more about some of the Australian writers, because there must be all Australian alternate histories and New Zealand and that kind of thing, and stuff going on in the Far East. It could be a little more difficult as a reader to get a handle on some of these things. If you don't know the real history, it's hard to understand the alternate history, but with a bit of skill and maybe a little extra research, it can certainly be done.
And it's hard to name a specific period for me in a lot of the Far East, because I simply don't know enough. This is not where I've spent my time, and it's all new to me.
Yeah,
I'd like to see more generally.
Yeah. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about the difficulties of research of those particular things, and I think one one answer is to not take the easy answer necessarily, look deeper all of the time. So let me just look down here for a moment. People are talking in the Q&A about places like pre-colonial India, which I think would be very interesting as well. So there's obviously a lot of places. Somebody says, is it too dangerous to take a turning point in history and hypothesize from there? Well, that's what we're doing all the time.
That's what an alternate history is. That's what we were talking about.
Are people too invested in the history that has happened to let writers explore such branching? The person here is specifically talking about what happens to African Americans if Lincoln is not assassinated. No, I think a lot of us are willing to go in a variety of different directions when it comes to alternate histories and take the path not, look at the path not taken and see where it leads.
Right.
Yeah, as opposed to somebody who deliberately goes back and messes things up or tries to, quote, correct things.
Ah, yes, there's a whole different genre of time travel stories where people go and try and fix history and hijinks ensue. It generally doesn't go well.
Right. And I think just based on some of the question, the idea of are we attached to history as it is, I think it comes down to how well the writer captures the turning point, what the change was, and how big of an impact it would be. It would make, and if you're talking about of turning that the whole ship of slavery, I'm like, let's talk about the difference of Lincoln may have freed the slaves, but we didn't have pushes towards more equal treatment until like the 1960s. So there's a time period breaks, and so the question is, when you make that turn, are you putting in enough to show we're changing culture, economics, and people's belief systems to make that change believable? Because you know, sometimes we'd like to think it's one single item, but usually there's multiple little things that are all interconnected. And so I think the question becomes, if somebody makes a change and we're like, I don't buy it, that's usually where the problems arise. And I think that's one of the key points is when you're trying to mine it, making sure you're looking at everything. That just sounds like so much rather than a single event or a battle. Like what are the cultural ramifications?
Yes, it's easy to see history changing in some ways because of a battle that was lost instead of won, because of the weather and on that particular day. And I think that's why a lot of those are popular branch points for alternate history. But there's a lot of broad swells in society that are much more difficult to derail, to push off to one side and to make completely different. Sorry, go ahead.
No, my Monatus universe is keyed on the idea that the Roman Church kind of discombobulated in the so-called Dark Ages and never quite got the hegemony over Northern Europe that it did. And everything else follows after that. And my story has nothing to do with the breakpoint. It has to do with the world that the breakpoint made and what happened and how people are now living in that universe. And of course, it's the only one they know. And they don't have any idea that it could be anything else.
Yeah. Because
that's the story.
And then there are some alternate histories, some worlds that are extremely different from the one we live in now. Turtledove was mentioned earlier on. He has a short piece called Down in the Bottomlands, which is the world if the Mediterranean was a bowl and not a sea, and Neanderthals had continued to live on. And so that's kind of interesting. Probably several other examples. West of Eden by Harry Harrison, where dinosaurs did not die out. The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson, where the plague took out most of Northern Europe and different cultures completely are coming to the fore. So there's plenty of scope to play with, like the vast upheavals that you can create in that kind of way.
Journey to Fuzang, where the Mongols just took over Europe after the Black Death.
Yeah, I'd like to have seen the organizational power they'd have had to generate to do that properly. But yeah, I haven't read the book, so maybe they can do that. And if people have any other examples of that kind of way out, right on the edge, out of the box, alternate histories. Guess not.
Go on to the next.
Say again?
On to the next. Research.
On to the next. Research, yes, let's talk about how we research. Who would like to start this? Let me actually start somebody off. Jean, go ahead. How about your research methods?
My research methods start with primary sources, which are things that were written at the time the events happened. I think they're more reliable, and I think they're more interesting because you get all the detail.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to demonstrate how you can get information from something as prosaic as the US Census. We are doing a census this year, and this census that I'm going to show you, I'm going to take the screen. Okay, this one was done in 1920, and I picked it at random. It's for Columbia, South Carolina. Let's see, come on, there we go. This woman here, Christine Moore, lives on Hyde Street. This is her house number. It tells you that she owns a house that is worth $1,500, which is pretty good in those days. That's her name. The little X means that she was the person who gave this information to the census taker. And this tells us that she is the head of the household, and it gives us her statistical data. She's female, Negro, age 48, widowed. And yeah, they changed that. This gives the relationship of all these people to her, to the head of the household. This is her mother, Della Williams, which is different from her last name, which means that she's been married. And her first son is also named Williams. So what does that tell you? That tells you that she was not married when she had Gus. These boys were named Feisters. So she married after she had a child, and then somehow she married again as a after Mr. Feister died. So this is just from glancing at the census. There is so much in here that you really should be looking at to make stories. Plus, you can get more information from things like newspapers and court records. And this is one that I created. It's too big to really pop it in right now. But if you want to get this presentation, look under this URL, which is a folder of material that gives you resource information, how to find things and where to find things. So if everybody has that written down, I'll move on. Okay, thank you, that's it.
Okay, great. That's a really good way of getting information, getting solid information about how people lived and how, you know, how societies were made up and what you could expect in certain areas. Okay, Melissa, would you like to talk about research?
my favorite rabbit hole, yes. There's so much information. I think everybody is familiar with most of the things you can get from a library, and my God, the research librarian you should make best friends with. I'm not sure what the appropriate gift for a research librarian is, sort of rubies and gold, but when I was working on Shadow Man, which is a science fiction novel involving, I was doing research on intersexuality specifically, and the local research librarian was able to turn up for me a book from Johns Hopkins, one of the first studies of intersexuality done before plastic surgery was possible, and was a series of, essentially, it included a series of case histories of a wonderful and fascinating group of people who were living perfectly normal lives, who were also intersexual, ranging from the person who was a circus act to the person who was offered the first experimental plastic surgery to make them either male or female, to which they replied, actually, no, that would spoil everything. And I thought, this is not the story that you hear told from the outside. This is the story you hear from some specific people whose lives were not whose lives did not follow the pattern that we've been told to expect. And I think it's finding those stories that is hardest and requires, as Jean said, as many original and contemporary sources as you can find. And those turn up through the libraries. Also, these days, the amateur experts on the internet, I can't say enough in praise of that community. I mean, you do have to be aware of their biases and specific, some people have definite hobby horses, but if you want a source to find out how the omnibuses ran in Victorian London, there's a place you can go and look at, I think, at least 7 years of omnibus schedules.
Mm.
There is a guy in Australia who will sell you a PDF of the owner's manual for a Ford Trimotor, complete with the advertising brochure, should you need to know how a Ford Trimotor works, and so on. And this is material that was not available 20 years ago, that you couldn't get. It was almost impossible to get hold of, and having it so widely available now is just, it's like being in a candy store. It's awesome.
Yes, and there are the people who recreate as well. In the Clash of Eagles series, I have Viking longships going up and down the Mississippi, and there are a whole lot of people out there who actually are sailing Viking longships around today, and you can read their blogs and you can ask them questions, and you can get the true feeling. In addition to all the historical research and archaeological research, you also get like the living and feeling of that.
Experimental archaeology people.
And you can get a lot of stuff, actually boots on the ground stuff. There are a lot of living museums. I mentioned the fact that I happen to live near Manhattan Island. So if I'm going to set my story in and around that area, which I do, I can actually go there and walk. When I set a story in England, I actually went to London and walked and took the tube and found out how long it takes to get from point A to point B. And I went to Oxford and I actually saw Mr. Dodson's digs and walked from one end to the other to find out how long it would take. Sometimes you actually have to do boots on the ground and do that. I do not necessarily recommend it for fight scenes, but you never know.
Yes,
on,
it
the
certainly helps.
on the other hand, I do have some experts who will help me because I do not do fights very well. I have never fought anybody in my life except verbally. So thank you, Teal James, for staging some fight scenes for me.
Somebody in the chat room says, librarians love to get challenging research questions, so you can also talk to librarians. Day, talk to us a little bit about your research methodologies and what you do to find out information.
I think, so I start out as just being the nerd who like watches way too many history programs and reads and stuff. And I think it starts from, you find something that sounds a little neat, and then you kind of go a little further from that and you start going, but is it so? And then as you start researching other things around it, you might find something that sparks your interest. So I actually don't start with primary sources because I'm not reading those for fun, not often, but sometimes. And so usually something starts with something that was an item of interest, and I go backwards from there. So as an example, it's not quite alternate history at this point, but the research part is true. I have a short film screening tonight at 8 p.m. about the Invalid Corps, and it's the Invalid Corps in the Civil War. And if you Google it now, you'll start to find a few websites on it, but there are no textbooks out. I think there are less than half a dozen journal articles. And when we started 5 years ago, there was even less of that. And it all started, my wife's a librarian, by the way, who found this ridiculous song about an invalid corps and making fun of them. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Why would somebody bother to make up a song that was very popular at one point in time, or, you know, shortly after the Civil War, about, you know, soldiers with disabilities? And then from there it went to, well, they made regiments of these men. And there was one within the Revolutionary War, which actually does have a little more information, mostly because the guy in charge of it was a little more well-known. We started digging and we started finding out more about them and their soldier and the soldiers and what was done and what they did. And you end up kind of, it blossoms from there. And I think that's what happens to most folks. You find one thing that catches you and then you kind of blossom from there. And then you start looking at the way it might bend and connect with history, or at least that's the way I go. I was doing something about amazing women in history and somebody had talked about Martha Costin, who invented the signal flare. And I'm like, well, she sounds really cool. So I started digging back into her and her in her invention, because yes, it's hers. Her husband may have had some cutesy little notes on paper, but that she's the one who made it work. That's my story. But I started reading about her and about signal flares. And then from there I went backwards and ended up getting pieces, because she wrote and published her own autobiography, because damn it, nobody's going to talk about a woman, so she might as well do it herself. And then from there, I thought, I want to write an alternate history. And I want to write an alternate history where she is seen and her contributions acknowledged, because I'm like, not as many people know that the signal flares we use today started with a woman shortly before the Civil War, and that the Costin Signal Company didn't shut down until 1985. That's how dominant it was within the industry. So I guess that's kind of where mine is. It's something that quirks your interest, and then from there you start playing with it, and then I end up going backwards to finding more history, or I'll be doing something else and I'll find a piece there, which is kind of like how Costin started. It was like, oh, this is a neat woman I'm reading about. Wait a minute, and then from there.
Yeah. For me, it's actually, it really depends on what kind of story I'm writing as to how I do the research, or what culture I'm researching as to how I do the research. When the Romans and Native Americans that are in the Clash of Eagles series, there's obviously a great deal about Rome already available. That's a culture that's been studied a great deal, and we've talked about it a lot already. For a lot of the Native American tribes, particularly those prior to the Columbus invasions, we actually don't know a great deal about even where some of those tribes were at the times, or what their customs were at those times. And so that takes a little bit more in-depth research. For Cahokia, there's a lot of archaeological and anthropological research. Some of it is in the public domain, and some of it is much more academically inclined. So you have to read through papers to find out what the best information is there about what they had in the midden heaps and all of that kind of thing, what they were eating through the bones of the creatures that were left behind, and so on. And more recently, I've been writing a book that's set in much more current times. It's an alternate Apollo story, like not Apollo the god, Apollo the spacecraft. So I have astronauts and that kind of thing. And for that, of course, there's a huge wealth of information. You can download all kinds of documents from NASA. You can download a 200-page document about exactly how the space suits worked. So that, in that case, the rabbit hole is different. There's all this really neat technical information that you can just kind of wade through. And obviously you don't need most of that to tell your story. But in that case, the problem is there's too much information rather than too little. So it's
you
kind
have
of,
to pare it down.
yeah, oh, absolutely, yes, and we will all tell you, all tell other writers, I'm sure, that all the research we do, only a very small amount of it gets onto the page, enough to flavor the book, enough to give a good foundation to the book, but certainly all the research we do, if that ended up on the page, it might be a kind of dull book.
It would be dull.
Yeah.
I guess the real criterion is, does it work for the story?
Yeah.
And once you aim at, how does this advance the plot, the character, the motivation, the story?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're writers. We're writing for entertainment. We're not, well, some of us are professors writing for professorial publication, but if you're writing for entertainment, for goodness sake, let's entertain.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
Go ahead, Dave, sorry.
That's okay. I'll be super quick. And one of the ways I can tell you that I address some of that is if it's a tidbit that I really, really love but can't use, I have saved them and have a lot of, and I call them my little book secrets, and I'll post them on my blog. So if somebody is as big a history nerd as I am, I'm like, let me give you some of Martha Costin's badass quotes about how they denied her because she was a woman. And so I will actually put those up and put things in there so if people like them. So like from Bob Eileen and the Clockwork Gin, I'm like, you know, I described the interior of an airship. Here are the photographs from the actual airship that I described it from, which is the R-11. So if I find a place to put it that's not my book, it makes it a little easier to not put too much in the book, because I guess it takes the pressure off.
Okay, this leads nicely into a question that we've been asked from the audience by Kelly Dwyer. What is the strangest piece of research that you've come across, and would it be believable by your readers if you included it in your books or stories? Who wants to take a swing at that one? Oh, I guess you do. Go ahead, Dave.
So I have a great so I have a short story that was on Apex magazine, and it was about it's about the first Black life-saving station and their most famous rescue. And I made it a lovely steampunk story where they have a, you know, they put a line out to the ship, and which was what actually happened originally. You put a line out and people kind of slide down this zip line back to safety. It was a little too dangerous. The line broke. So in my story, they actually pulled the ship to shore because, hello, they're half mechanical men. In the actual one, when it broke, they had a guy swim the line out. It wouldn't work because the winds and water was too high. So that guy swam back and forth, I think more than a dozen times, individually bringing back people in the middle of like this massive storm. He swam out like 13 times to bring people back. No one's gonna believe that. So I had my guy swim out once to take a spare line, and then they pulled the ship in, because if I said somebody swam out there 13 times, no one's gonna believe me to individually rescue people one by one.
Yeah, I keep constantly coming across stories from real life where I'm like, couldn't possibly put that in a book. Go ahead, Roberta, you had your hand up.
Well, when I was researching the Dodson Doyle books, I was going through Charles Dodson's diaries. And I found out that although he was pretty reclusive and stayed pretty close to Oxford, he actually took a trip to I was going to write a rather far-fetched spy novel about this, and I never did, but it just struck me as being such an odd thing for a sweet guy like Dodson to do, and it turned out that he was accompanying another clerical person who just needed somebody to be his dog's body for the trip, and representing the Church of England to the patriarch of the Church of, the Russian Church, in Queen Victoria's name, of course, as the head of the English Church. But it was a very odd sort of piece of information to come across, and I've never been able to use it since.
Cool. Melissa?
Possibly the best story I came across. I'm working on the Order of the Air series, which is set in Depression era America. It's sort of occult and aviation adventures. But I ended up reading to get the flavor of the period, I ended up reading most of the Arkansas Gazette and Democrat for the year of 1930, which is an interesting project. Never let anyone tell you that we are living in a uniquely criminous time. The Depression was not law-abiding, especially in that part of the South, and was one of the papers was the wet paper, the other paper was the dry paper. But you know, one was for prohibition, one was against it, and there were many stories, including Katie Sampson, who, on being arrested for stabbing her lover 3 times on the streetcar, explained that she did it because he had quote trifled on her one time too many. But the story that I don't think anybody would believe was the guy who was arrested for brewing he set up his still to make moonshine in the wrecked boilers of a steamboat, which he then was unable to tend correctly, and they exploded. And the entire 3 towns around, according to the Gazette, came running to collect the runoff. And somehow, the Prohibition agents never arrested nobody. And, you know, the bad part is when I talk to friends of my mother's who are old enough to remember, I get answers like, oh yeah, there was, if you want to know, all the speakeasies in Little Rock in 1936, they were on 2nd Street. I'm like, Ms. Vincent, how do you know this? Oh, my brother used to go there. He wouldn't take me, though.
I often find the little details kind of interesting. Like the example Connie Willis always comes up with was that Romans used to use umbrellas. They actually had umbrellas that they would carry around and protect them from the rain. And somehow you don't really see that on historical dramas. They're not really walking around with brollies. So it's some cute little things that look like anachronisms, but really aren't. We have another question. How much do you assume the reader knows so they can tell when the actual history ends and alternate history begins? How do you fill in the missing information? And that's particularly, I guess, apropos when you're using underutilized parts of history or places that the reader may not be quite so familiar with. Obviously, if you do a Hitler in the Second World War story, people are more likely to know the main thrust of that. But if you're doing something more interesting than that, how do you clue the reader in?
Throwaway dialogue.
Pardon?
Throw away dialogue.
Throw away dialogue.
Small bits of information that are sort of in there, but avoid, like the plague, the dreaded info dump. Do not say, 1,000 years ago this happened and therefore we are here. Or you do that very well.
Yes, I was going to say, there are better info dumps than that example, so thank you. Yeah, I actually like a good info dump, as I've said many times, as long as it's connected to character and as long as there's tension in there and all of that other dramatic stuff.
Yeah, well, I can get away with it. You can get away with it if you are in a murder mystery and somebody wants to know, how do you know that this thing does what it does? How do you know that this plant is going to poison you or something like that? And then the medical examiner goes into a long spiel.
So I actually would want to counter this with another question, and of the how important is that?
Yeah, how important is it to the story?
Right, because I'm writing a story about these events. They should all be interconnected and have relationships, like I said, the cultural, historical, all that, so it all makes sense. So if I have you entertained and everything is going well in the story, and it follows narrative flow and logic, does it matter that the reader know where it deviates? And I say that just because my thing's written in the Middle East. More than likely, most folks aren't going to know what that history is, so they're not going to know my deviation point necessarily. But does it matter if they're entertained in the story with the story? So I think that becomes the question: is how much does that matter?
And I would like to follow up on that, because I think it matters in that when you catch somebody with a good story and they want to know more, it's great if you have an afterword or some further note to say, start here. If you really want, it doesn't have any effect on the story or your enjoyment of the story itself, but for those you've caught, then you can move on. And I love it when people do that.
Yeah, which is why I put stuff on the website going, here are these neat little fun things.
Yes.
Let's nerd out.
Yeah. Yeah, the Clash series have appendices in there for people who want to know a little bit more about the alternate history and the actual history of the time that I'm talking about.
I do that with my straight historical mysteries. I have an afterword that says, this is what's true and this is what I made up.
Yeah, and that can be quite handy.
I have a question. Is that normal in alternate histories? Or should it be? Because I didn't even think about that as being a regular part of the book, but man, I would totally want that in every alternate history I read from this point on, because I'm the kind of nerd who's like, I would want to know what's real and what's not, and I would want to know where to go for more details. And yeah.
Most people who do alternate histories just assume you know.
Yeah, I think we as a panel in all books now.
Well, you know, there's a romance author called named Roberta Rogow, and she writes medieval romances. And one of her things is at the end, she will tell you exactly what she made up and what she took whole cloth. And I certainly think that science fiction and fantasy can do the same thing.
Yeah, I love it when people do that. And I do think it used to be more, it seems like it used to be more common. I seem to have seen it more earlier. I don't know.
I see it in a lot of historical mysteries, where they have a list, for instance, something set in London about the beginnings of the Metropolitan Police Force will have something. This and this and this is true, this and this and this I made up.
The flip side of that is a thing that I've run into with the Order of the Air books, where people think they know about a period and it's actually not accurate. What parts of the country, what parts of America had dial phones in 1929, 1930? What parts went through switchboards? And it actually makes some difference. And it's really hard to balance my nerdy desire to get it absolutely right with this is irrelevant to the story, really. And if people assume, if you don't know that there's dial phones in Chicago, for example, is it going to throw the reader out of the story? This, when they saying, but wait a minute, shouldn't they be going with a switchboard? Shouldn't there be an operator? I see that, that's how you see it in the movie. And how to balance that is always a really, I think, tricky question, because it's not actually relevant to the story.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
you know, I think it's impossible for you to know as the author what the reader knows.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some little tiny things that have thrown me out of a story simply because that was something I was interested in. And there's just no way for you to know it.
Yeah. Okay, talking of being thrown out, we're getting towards the end of our time here, so I'm being asked to wrap up here. We got a lot of really good questions in the end. Sorry we didn't get to them all. I know a number of the panelists will be up for continuing the discussion on Discord later on. For now, I'm going to ask people to sign off by saying where people can find them online or be found again during Balticon. So I'll go in the same order as I did in the beginning. Day, what else you tell people how to get in touch with you?
Awesome. And I'm having a moment because I'm going, I know I have a reading today and I can't remember what time it is.
Well, there is a program. So.
There is a program. I do have a reading further this afternoon. I would love to have folks there. The other place that I would actually strongly encourage you guys is I am screening my short film, actually I have to say award-winning film, The Invalid Corps, about the Invalid Corps in the Civil War and what they did to save the Union, at 8 p.m. tonight. I promise it'll be fun, and I promise to give away some extra fun little like historical tidbits afterwards as a part of that. Other than that, you can find me on the internet, the same as my name, Al-Mohamed.com. Most recent is Labyrinth's Archivist, and we have the new re-release of Baba Ali and the Clockwork Djinn. And with that, thank you for coming. You guys are amazing. I love when an audience is into the topic as much as you guys have been.
Yay, great. Thanks very much. Go ahead, Jean.
In order to get all of that information and the lists of resources and such, go to tinyurl.censusinformation. And there you can download whatever's there. And I will be in the chat room, so please, I hope to see you.
Okay, great. Roberta.
I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook author page called Manata Skyline. And if you want to read the Dodson Doyle books or the Manatas books or my most recent book, They're all ebooks. They're available through Amazon. Just key in my name and they'll all pop up. And I will be singing in the open film tonight.
Okay, great. And Melissa.
You can find me on the web at melissa-scott.com. The hyphen is important, otherwise you get a televangelist. Yeah, I'm on Twitter as @BlueTerraplane. And I'll be heading to the chat rooms after this, and I will also be on another panel at 5.
Okay, great. I have a reading tomorrow morning from Eagle and Empire at 10 a.m. You can find me online at alansmale.com, Alan Smale on Facebook and Twitter, and my email address, unsurprisingly, is alansmale@gmail.com. And I have a collection coming out from Wordfire Press with Rick Wilbur this summer in August the 5th is actually the publication date. So that's it. Thank you very much indeed. You've been a great audience. You've been a great panel. I've enjoyed it a lot. And thanks very much. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.